Started. Thank you all for joining us today for our first PAVE weekly virtual panel of 2021. We're delighted to be continuing this series we started last May, and we have some great content ahead for you all this year. This month in January, we're focusing on looking at the year ahead and what's to come in the world of automated vehicle technology. We're excited to kick things off this year with a great conversation on the road ahead. Today's panel is a special two-conversation style with two different guests, so make sure you stay on after this first one wraps up to hear the second half. So my name is Tabitha Colter, and I'm PAVE's Director of Operations and your moderator for the first half of today's panel. I'm absolutely thrilled to get to introduce you all today to our first amazing panelist, Aicha Evans, Chief Executive Officer of Zoox. Before joining Zoox, Aicha was Senior Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer at Intel Corporation, where she was responsible for driving Intel's long-term strategy to transform it from a PC-centric company to a data-centric company. So needless to say, she's been a key player in this space for a long time. And we're so excited to have her on today to discuss the work that she and Zoox are doing in the AV space. Aicha, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it. Much appreciated. And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. So I want to just dive right in and start with kind of a bigger question about Zuccs Strategy and what's to come. So Zoox kind of flew under the radar a bit at first, up until the last year or so when we started seeing a much bigger public presence from the company. Can you talk a little bit about that strategy of starting quietly and the most important takeaways that you hope the public gets from your increased presence now?
Well, fundamentally, Zoox is about reinventing personal transportation, making it safer, cleaner, and more enjoyable for everyone. We've been at this for 6 years, so 6 years in the making. Our approach, we've been super consistent from the ground up and really vertical integration. And so we didn't really want to come out and be talking about a lot of things that we're doing. We wanted to show what we were doing. And we're at a point where the vehicle is, it drives, it's ready. It's not a concept car. And all of the things that we focused on, designing it for cities, designing it for the riders, because this is really about offering rides to people as opposed to selling vehicles. Now that all of that is ready and we're now at a period of testing and getting to market, we felt it was the right time to basically show it. The second aspect is to start a conversation with the public about what this is going to feel like, what this is going to look like, get some feedback, and really adjust where needed.
Yeah, wanted to give a quick plug to the awesome Zoox YouTube page, which we recommend all the time as a great educational source to kind of see those rides she's talking about. And that recent video of you and Jesse taking that ride in San Francisco, especially if you haven't checked that one out, it's definitely worth looking at.
That was fun, for sure.
Yeah. And so speaking of that recently unveiled new vehicle, it's obviously gotten a lot of attention, and we were wondering if you would be willing to kind of walk us through some of the most important design features. Like, what can we learn about the business and the technology of AVs from the vehicle?
So really, the first thing is it's for riders. And for us, if you step into the vehicle and you're being transported and you think about driving, we actually failed because you shouldn't be thinking about that. The second thing is it's a very small footprint so that it's very maneuverable around dense urban environment, meaning cities. But inside, it's very roomy. And whether you want to ride alone, which you have that option, or you want to ride with friends or family, or you want to do post-pandemic, right? You want to share the ride with somebody else. All those options are available. It's bidirectional. Symmetrical, it's carriage seating, active suspension, because we don't want you to feel the ride. Again, you're being transported. The way you also enter the vehicle, it's sliding doors, so it's very inviting. Sit down, buckle up, and then each passenger really, whether you're alone or with others, you have your little screen that shows you the status of the route. It shows you also music if you want to play some, and you can also control your AC. From a maneuverability standpoint, another thing we have is four-wheel steering. Even though it's cute to see the vehicle maneuver, it's also very important in terms of just accuracy for the autonomy stack and the amount of error that it has to deal with when it's following a trajectory.
Yeah. That's super fascinating. So I know that one phrase that you all use a lot at Zooks is built from the ground up. You refer to that a lot with your AV as being built from the ground up. Could you talk to us a little today about what that means exactly? What helps differentiate it from other vehicles? What are some of those unique things that go into the Zooks vehicle?
So fundamentally, this company was founded on a premise. And the premise is that every time the driver changed, the vehicle was re-architected. Excuse me. Sorry. The vehicle was re-architected to fit the driver. So if you look at a passenger car today, from the context of a driver, a human driver, it makes a lot of sense. You have a steering wheel, you have windshield, mirrors, even the seating arrangement, the people behind you are behind you so that they don't distract you. And if we agree that AI is going to drive and humans are just going to enjoy the ride, our premise, our hypothesis, our core belief is that you have to redesign and re-architect the vehicle to make it easiest and safest for AI to drive. And that's what we mean by the ground up. There's also a certain element of development speed, the type of optimizations you make, because again, you're trying to make it easier from a sensor architecture standpoint, from a compute standpoint for AI to drive. So that's what we mean by the ground up.
That's fascinating. So switching gears a little bit from the design of the vehicle to the experience of actually riding in it, which we know you've gotten to do, I'd love to hear you explain firsthand what the goals are for the Zoox customer experience. Who is the Zoox AV for? How do you envision it fitting into the broader transportation landscape for the public?
So starting in dense urban environment, I don't know about you. I live in the Bay Area, and under normal circumstances, meaning no pandemic, I have to go to the city, once or twice a week, and there's always a one-on-one with myself. Am I going to drive? Or am I going to use mobility on demand? And most of the time, I end up using mobility on demand because, again, when I think about just the practicalities, I think about costs, I think about parking, and so on and so forth. So, from a customer standpoint, you basically have an app, and you order a ride and say, I want to go from point A to point B. It shows you that it's selecting a vehicle. Then the vehicle shows up, doors open, you step in, sit down, buckle up, and basically push start, and then you're being transported. When you're in the vehicle, it's funny because the first like 5 minutes, you're like, wow, this is like amazing.
Yeah.
And then frankly, and I hope the crew doesn't get mad at me for saying this, it's actually boring. It's like, oh, I'm just being transported. Okay, I'm on my phone, or I'm on the little screen, or I'm reading a book. And so that's the point. And then when by the time you're dropped off, the next customer is ready to be picked up. And this is key because, when you have passenger vehicles today, so let's say you go to the city, really 4% of the time the vehicle is being used. 96% of the time it's sitting, occupying space, and depreciating. And here it's really a better and more efficient way of moving everybody in cities, because when I'm not using it, the next customer is using it, and it's constantly moving. And then with a 16-hour battery charge, we're able to basically move people around and then only go back to base to charge for a couple of hours and back on the road.
That's great. I love that point too about it being boring. I know when we do our own PAVE, demonstration events at the public, we love to hear that, that it's really exciting and it's fun to do at first, and then it's just like any other ride that you're taking that day. Yeah. So as we do with kind of all of our PAVE virtual panels, we asked questions from the audience as they registered, and we received quite a lot for you all. It's very popular. And one of the most common ones we got was a question about whether Zoox is working in the goods delivery space, of course, often sparked by your relationship with Amazon. So people were wondering, is Zoox involved in the goods delivery space, or is your focus more on human transport?
Our focus is on human transport and people moving. Now, obviously, we have industrial designers and people who are looking more at the future. And yes, they have all kinds of concepts for doing all kinds of things. Look, I think it's a fair question given Amazon. But when you look at where the demand is, where the economic demand is, right now it's people movers. Once you are able to do that, obviously, you can also move goods. So we'll concede that at some point, that's something we'll consider. But for now, focus, and get the basic technology and people moving around cities.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And, we look forward to learning more in the future. Another big topic that we see come up in our panels and audience questions often has to do with scaling. Kind of the most typical question we receive is, when will AVs be in my city? That's a little specific, so I want to rephrase it to you in kind of a broader way of what are the challenges to scaling this type of technology, and what is Zoox doing to overcome those challenges?
Look, we're still at the beginning of the journey. This is really a big change in transportation for everybody. Safety is paramount. A lot of people can drive, but being able to do it safely and repeatably. And so it's going to be a little bit of a while. We have this mantra at Zooks that says tiny, small, medium, large, scale, rinse and repeat. And so it'll take a few years, but once we are able to do it in a city and then repeat from there, we'll scale a lot faster. When you have disruptive technology at the beginning, right? We talk about the iPhone a lot as a disruptor in personal communication. I think people forget that initially the iPhone was on the AT&T network only, and now it's all around the world, right? A couple decades later. So people can expect that eventually it will get to them, but we're going to start in a very measured way and then expand from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about the kinds of cities or locations or people that might expect AVs to become a part of their lives in the next 5 years, you're saying you think that will mostly be cities and expand, or is that the strategy?
Yes, it's cities first and then expand. I mean, it's well documented that we're testing in Las Vegas, so I think it's fair to expect us to be deploying there. I affectionately call it the one street dense urban environments, the strip, right? There's a lot going on there and a lot of demand for moving people between hotels and places and so on. And then we're also testing in San Francisco. So I think it's fair to expect us to be there. And San Francisco is particularly important to us because it's a very tough driving environment. And also from a weather standpoint, you have to deal with rain, you have to deal with fog. And so we feel that by driving there and by sort of our stack learning and hardening and from a safety standpoint, then it will make a lot of other cities easier.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. So kind of given PAVE's goal of public education, of course, we're constantly having conversations directly with the public or within the industry to kind of fine tune those topics that we need to make progress on. So thinking about 2021, I'm curious what some of the most important lessons that you would like to see the public learn about AVs are, as kind of a final way to wrap up our conversation.
Well, first of all, I mean, this is our commitment to the public. As an industry, we're going to be responsible collectively. This is really key. This is going to be a long journey, and making sure that we engage with the public and talk about what this product is, what this will enable them to do. Obviously, we're going to be testing on private and eventually also public roads. So getting feedback from the people that we're transporting is going to be key. And really, sort of finding our place in the natural habitat of society. We feel that there are a lot of benefits. This is beneficial, obviously, for the customer, but it is also beneficial for cities and how they are architected and constructed. When you have a city like San Francisco, where 30% of the traffic is really caused by people looking for parking, and 30% of the total real estate footprint is also used for parking. Now, imagine returning that. This is also a city that has a housing crisis, right? So you could have housing, you could have more economic activities because there are more buildings available for companies to move in. Obviously, the environment and safety. I think you'll be talking to my colleague Mark Rosekind. What's going on from a fatality standpoint, both in the United States and globally, is not something that we should accept. So really starting that dialogue with customers so that by the time we deploy and scale, this is natural and people have had a chance to really understand what this technology is about, what the product is about, and what it is able to offer to them and to society.
Yeah, absolutely. And, of course, at PAVE, we really want to stress the points of that point of, collective responsibility and engaging directly with the public. That's super important to us. Well, Aicha, thank you so much for the time that you've given us. I think we're at the end of the time with you. And I just want to say thank you again for coming on this panel, lending your expertise to the beginning of 2021 with us and our audience. We're, of course, excited about what's to come this year for Zooks and all of our other PAVE members. And we really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to having you hopefully for a ride after the pandemic. Thank you.
Absolutely. Up next, I'm going to hand it over to my Executive Director, Tara Andringa, who will be talking with Zooks Chief Safety Innovation Officer, Mark Rosekind.
Thank you so much, Tabitha. And thank you so much to Mark for joining us for the second half of this discussion. Welcome, Mark, to our first panel of 2021.
And always a pleasure to support PAVE. So thank you for letting Zooks have a presence here.
Well,
Happy New Year.
Same to you. And Zoox was one of PAVE's founding members. Before PAVE had a name or a staff or anything, Zoox was one of the organizations that had come together to start the conversation about founding PAVE. So they're very dear to our hearts. So Mark is a former NHTSA administrator, former board member of the NTSB, and the current Chief Safety Innovation Officer at Zoox. I think that you probably have a broader view of AV safety than anyone. So we both wanted to talk to you a little bit about Zoox's approach to safety, spend a few minutes just looking ahead at the year generally in terms of AVs. And we also have gotten lots and lots of viewer questions as people signed up for the panel today about safety. So wanted to hit you with some of those as well. The first question we want to ask, we were just, Tabitha talked to Aicha about Zoox's frequent phrase that the vehicle was built from the ground up. And we wanted to talk to you about that in a safety context. Some of the main things that Zoox highlights are the safety innovations. I think I read somewhere that there were about 100 or more. Can you help us to understand what some of those safety features are and why they're so important to the vehicle?
So let's start with the context, which is even at NHTSA, constantly talking about how people have this thought that somehow you can have safety or innovation, but not both. If you want safety, it's got to be, constrained by a regulatory framework that innovation really may have no role. If you want innovation, you think Silicon Valley and let's break a lot of things, which in the road safety realm is like the worst thing, right? Because then you're talking about lives and injuries and crashes. So what's interesting is at NHTSA, we try to put that together and actually say what we need in this moment is safety innovation. So as much as everybody is thinking about all the cool technology innovation that's going on, that's allowing all of these advancements, how do we think about same concept, but in the safety realm? So that's where the safety innovation sort of label came from. And I'll give you 3 examples, but we'll start with one that is now on our website that I love. It's kind of the model that we're using. But, in a traditional vehicle, the first thing that could hurt you in a crash is the steering wheel. Right? I mean, that's why the airbag is there. And ironically, of course, even the airbag, like in the Takata situation, could end up harming you if you're not. So if we get rid of the steering wheel, like in our carriage seating, then it allows you to totally reimagine what the airbag could be designed to protect people. So you only get to do that if you're building a vehicle from the ground up, not retrofitting a vehicle that's built around a driver in the left seat. This is what Aicha was explaining, right? Mm-hmm. You've got the steering wheel and the mirrors and the windshield and where people sit. That's all designed around where somebody is driving in the left front seat. So from the ground up means you get to think about what's the best way to do autonomy and where the sensors fit. Or in this case, for safety, how do we build an airbag, designed specifically to protect people in this environment? And so I hope people go to our website. If I do the plug, it's zooks.com, because we have, I've been wanting to talk about this for a long time, but we have 100+ safety innovations. This is one example when you're building from the ground up, and you need to look at the airbag because it's a totally new design. It's actually got 2. There's a curtain airbag. First of all comes down from the ceiling. There's a curtain airbag that basically protects passengers from each other and flying laptops and everything else that's in there. And then a secondary one that's right in front of you, protecting the head, neck, chest, etc. So totally new design, already been doing crash testing and doing very well with it, but it lets you reimagine how you want to protect people when you're not stuck with a historic design. That's what the ground up means. And in safety innovation, I think the airbag design is just a great example. Let me do 2 others quickly.
Sure.
Things that don't exist today. Most people don't realize, but there's a different crash worthiness standard for the front seat versus the back seat in a vehicle. Higher for the front seat, because that's where your driver is. Mm-hmm. And so why that's relevant is when all of us get into a taxi or into a ride sharing situation, we're going actually into the back seat, which has a lower crash worthiness rating than the front seat. In our carriage seating, we can actually design for the highest front seat level crash worthiness in all seating positions. So wherever you get, whatever seat you take, wherever you get into our vehicle, you're going to have the highest level crash worthiness that you can get. And again, already doing crash tests showing how well we're doing in those arenas. And the third one I'll give you is not only because we're designing, but also operating a fleet. Our vehicle doesn't begin until you've actually buckled up. And so, the number one thing, we know 91% of people are wearing seatbelts nowadays, but in crashes where people die, 50% of the people were not wearing their seatbelt. And so at least to make sure we start that ride with everyone buckled up, is a critical safety thing. So those are just 3 examples of the 100+ that are built in, because again, building it from the ground up means you get to rethink and reimagine all these opportunities.
That's fantastic. It's actually funny. You take me back to my childhood. I grew up with a dad in the auto industry, and in the 1970s, he had a rule. He would turn around and wouldn't start the car until everyone had a seatbelt on. So I feel like I'm 5 again. That's great.
But it worked.
It worked.
It worked.
So a lot of our viewers probably know this, but the state of California offers permits for companies to test their vehicles, and there are 2 levels. You can get a testing permit with a human safety driver and without, and Zoox is one of just 5 companies that has a permit for driverless testing. I wanted to ask you, how does Zoox determine when it can take that human safety net out of the vehicle? How do you prove that level of safety to yourself?
So, Tara, this is not just a good question, but it's a hard question. And I say that because what's interesting is this is the new version of the question that people have been asking for several years now. How safe is safe enough? And so this is the new version. I just say we're starting the new year. Let's watch for this being the question now in the next year. But if you put them together, it's the same question. How safe is safe enough for us to actually get rid of that safety driver? Okay. So let me answer in sort of 2 levels, the larger conceptual one, and then more specifically about Zoox. What's interesting about this question is we've never figured this out. We've had 100 years of road safety, and we've never figured this out. Because if you think about it, wouldn't it be great if you could have a PAVE panel that says, so what are the metrics? And tell me what the numbers are that we've got a safe system. Well, in 2019, 36,096 people lost their lives on our roadways. That's not good. That should not be acceptable to us. And we know that, over 2 million injuries, over 6 million crashes, the costs, and I'm not talking money, but the cost to all of us for this is just tremendous. It's the leading cause of death in young people, et cetera. It's just, we should not be accepting this, and you wish we could have a pandemic like, it's like, this should not be acceptable. Let's go at this, right? But it's very difficult. And that's what I'm saying, in 100 years, we haven't figured it out. So I find it so interesting that now that we're talking all these new technologies, just conceptually, everyone's like, so how safe is safe enough? It's like, couldn't figure it out in 100 years. Don't think in the next year or so that there's going to be one metric or one number that's going to define all of this. And so that's why specifically, now let me take that, well, great. How do you take that general, thinking about this to something specific? Well, at Zoox, we have a variety of very stringent internal system safety targets that we've already established. And those specific targets are then continually evaluated using simulation, private track, as well as real world testing to make sure we make the safety case. And then we're using several methodologies, not one, but several together, so we can be able to quantify and demonstrate that our technology actually provides safety greater than what we get with human drivers. And then Zoox is only going to launch a driverless vehicle service on public roads when we've got those targets achieved. So I'm saying that because, again, I think we don't talk enough about system safety targets. We have safety elements built into hardware, software, the vehicle, and operations. And so it's kind of fantasy for people to say, what's the number? What's the specific? Because there's a whole collection of these. And so for all the great SAE, UL, there's like a bunch of great work that's going on, even your work with others about the nomenclature, et cetera. These are all different safety elements. There's not one. And I think that's what people have to do, is set their targets, have a quantified way to demonstrate whether they're meeting them or not. And then you don't deploy until you make sure you've achieved them.
When it's actually one of your points I've seen you make in the past over the years, Mark has this slide that I've always found to be one of the most powerful things. It's just a plain black slide with the big white number 0. And your point being that like 0 is really the only acceptable answer to what level of death is appropriate, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly.
So
Another.
I think so now let's have a conversation instead of just getting through the questions, because I think you're right on target. And some people don't like to talk about that. But there is a movement for Vision Zero that's been around for a long time. And before leaving NHTSA, with Federal Highway and FMCSA, put together a Road to Zero coalition, which two very good friends, Dr. Jeff Michael, who was an associate administrator at NHTSA, Debbie Hersman, who at the time, former chairman of the NTSB that I worked with, she was president and CEO of the National Safety Council. And they put this Road to Zero coalition together, which has 1,600 organizations now that participate. And they spent a year with RAND putting a publication together. How could we actually get to zero? So there's a report that shows by 2050, at least in the United States, we could get to zero with 3 things. Keep doing what's working, emphasize safe system, and advance new technology.
Right.
And so that's why we're having this conversation, because the new tool on that list are these new technologies that are going to create new opportunities for us to go after that zero. But even then, if we were all in, we're looking at 30 years to see something like that. Right. And I think that's a great societal focus. But your question, which is really important, is every company developing this technology needs their own internal targets that they quantify, whether they're being met or not, to ensure that you're going to make sure you can literally say what you're going to put on the road meets the safety targets.
Right. Actually, we got an interesting question sort of along that lines about testing. And someone asked an interesting question, if you're testing in Northern California, how do you test adverse weather conditions? They, asked about like rain and snow and ice, and how does Zoox test for those kinds of things?
Yeah, and I thought Aicha did a great job just inserting that into whatever answers, which is part of the reason we're in San Francisco. Just think about geography as well as weather. Right? We're talking narrow streets. And if you've ever been down Lombard, and winding down and just, the angle on those streets, as well as fog and rain, right? So for Zoox, we expect to be, operating day and night and in all weather conditions. And at this moment, we're testing in environments that, as Aicha was just saying, gets us to the rain, including heavy rain and fog, etc. And to what we were just talking about, we wouldn't deploy in other settings that had snow or ice until we had done sufficient testing, meeting our safety targets to know it was okay to operate there. And that's why that question is so important, is you got to acknowledge both what the capabilities and limitations of a particular system are, so that you're only operating in arenas that are safe. This is why the ODD, the operational design domain, is so important. Because right now, think about what Aicha was just talking about: Las Vegas, San Francisco. We weren't talking about the Northeast at this moment, right?
Yeah. So, Zoox is doing such amazing things, but just wanted to take for a minute to try to put your former NHTSA hat on, and wondered if you could just kind of talk about, we have a new administration coming, where you sort of see AV policy and transportation policy more generally in the year ahead.
So let me just admit my bias, having worked in the Obama administration. But I'm really excited about what the Biden-Harris administration could be doing. There's just so many opportunities. And we can just stay in public domain information. If you think about it, President-elect put out a very big, bold infrastructure proposal. The nominee for Secretary of Transportation had an infrastructure proposal. The former mayor of South Bend also had Vision Zero in his city. So I think there's just a real big opportunity to see major transportation advances happen, through this administration. And having said that, I think that same opportunity extends to AVs. I think people automatically go to regulation or hands off. It's like, no, we need these big opportunities with infrastructure, probably smart infrastructure. What does that Vision Zero actually translate into reality? And in the AV space, you see the work that's already being done. And again, just to highlight PAVE, things like the nomenclature, right? What's the terminology that gets used? There's all kinds of opportunities for DOT, NHTSA, and the industry to come together to really push these things now in a much more coordinated, integrated opportunity, which I think is just going to advance, the benefits getting here sooner than if we have all these different separate things that are going on.
Right.
So I'm excited. I think there's a lot of opportunity ahead.
Well, and then my little, PAVE plug is obviously Zooks has been committed from day one of PAVE's founding to this idea that we will be more successful in achieving potential for AVs if the public is on board. What role do you see that public information and education being in AV policy going forward?
I put it number one. It's just it's foundation. Well, it's foundational, and part of this, I've been around for a while, and as many people know, I started my career as a scientist and doing sleep and fatigue work, and I can tell you, everybody wants to change their work schedule. How long your pilots can fly and truck drivers can drive, and our docs and nurses are on shift at the hospital, and I'll tell you, those are really hard to change. And the only way you could do it was by starting with education. Get people informed, about sleep and circadian rhythms, et cetera. So I've got like several decades of experience telling you, if you want to make these hard societal changes in these environments that are very well structured and established, you've got to start with education. And I think here is the perfect example, is that if you want people, and we see it already today, many people don't even know what technology they have in their car, let alone how it works. And so to get even more advanced technology in vehicles that people will be riding in or taking a ride in, then I think education is absolutely foundational for this to move ahead. And the reason I keep bringing that up is because the benefits are so tremendous, right? It's the trifecta. We get safety, we get mobility, we get sustainability. Anything we do that limits those means we're paying a price, right? For not being able to go as far as we can with these technologies. So I absolutely think education is critical. And I'm sure there's going to be a question about when are we going to see, wide develop, the deployment. And, Tabitha asked Aicha about scaling, et cetera. But the reason I bring that up is because the actual deployments are going to happen tomorrow, not the wide scale stuff. And so we need to use this time to do the education that we're talking about right now, right? To prepare ourselves for what's coming.
And then this is a question that came in from the audience that kind of bridges both the regulatory piece and the Zoox piece. Someone asked, what are the regulatory barriers or steps that a company like Zoox has to take for a commercial deployment, and both what have you had to do so far, and what are the things that are still ahead in terms of regulatory requirements?
Yeah, and another really good question, and also really hard. And what's interesting is it raises something that's not often discussed, but one of the reasons so many different folks are doing development in current vehicles, just retrofitting them, is because those are already FMVSS, Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard compliant vehicles. And so yes, you add a challenge to build from the ground up, but clearly we felt, as Aicha again described, having that integrated system is critical to getting maximum benefit in safety, mobility, as well as sustainability. And so there are traditional mechanisms that you can use to try and do things a little different than what's out there. And while I won't get into specifics, I will just say that Zoox basically has taken an approach that we can meet or exceed the safety, regulatory, and legal requirements in the current structure. Okay, so there is a structure. And what's interesting is people ask about this all the time. And outside of the FMVSS compliance stuff, there's actually no barriers related to the new technology and software. So the AI as a driver, there's actually nothing that's a barrier there. That's why we're already seeing people, jamming a lot of stuff into vehicles because there are no really regulatory constraints there at all. And so for the other part, again, and I'm just repeating myself, but Zooks is going to, make sure that we meet and or exceed the safety, regulatory, and legal requirements in the current structure. And we think that's an important way to demonstrate, frankly, that the current system works, and that you can do this within that current system. Which is not to say there isn't more coming in the future,
right?
But we believe this can be done in the current structure.
No, that makes sense. Want to be sure that we got a lot of great questions from the audience, so we want to make sure to get some of these in. Another one that I'm sure there are a million answers to, and I'm just curious how you'd respond. It's, what do you view as the primary high-level challenges and hurdles for the widespread deployment of passenger AVs?
This is another really good question because I think most people love to focus on the technology challenges. And as people now love to write headlines about how everything's been delayed, what's really interesting to me is when I've asked really smart people that are working on the engineering technical challenges, that's not what's holding us back. There's a lot to be done and there's a lot to accomplish. But my take on this question, which I'm kind of starting to say out loud, is I think the biggest challenge is the actual deployment. So we'll get the technology figured out, whether it's this month or next year. That stuff's actually going to get figured out. We're really good at that, actually. I think the challenge is, how do you deploy these in cities, or in other environments? And so, where do you pick up and drop off? Some cities, they're still learning where their curb space is, and they're struggling with current ride hailing because of that. Our vehicle's all electric, and by the way, nobody's talked about this much yet, but we revealed that it has a 16-hour life, okay? And immediately people say, well, how many miles is that? This is supposed to operate for a day in a city. It's not about the miles per se. It's about 16 hours of operation, in a city, but it's all electric. So where do we maintain it? Where do you park it in those off hours, those 8 off hours? Where's it maintained? Where's it serviced? What about the grid in the city? If you have an all-electric fleet that needs to be plugged in. And so I think a lot of this, I love to say the rubber meets the road in the cities. That's where these are going to, I think, start, maybe on the highways with some of the trucking work that's going on. But I think it's the actual deployment that's going to raise some real world challenges that we're going to have to figure out. And I think those are just starting to come up as people are starting to look at how to actually, how do we not just demonstrate this, but offer a service, whether it's in Arizona or in closed communities. It's like, okay, now we got to deal with like the real stuff. How do I know where to go? How close is the vehicle to where I actually get it? And all the real world pragmatics of how to make this function safely and effectively. Those are going to be the big challenges that we're just realizing are going to take some time to figure out.
What's interesting that actually just got a question from in the last 24 hours from someone who registered, who said that they're actually a city council person. And the question they asked was, what are the best practices that cities can put into place to help them be ready for AVs? Like, from Zoox's perspective, what would make a city more hospitable for a company to come and test or deploy there?
So that, again, what a great question. And I have a standard response to that, which is, and PAVE, please. It's like, I always tell the city, get educated. I mean, that's the first thing, is learn about the technology, learn about what the capabilities are, learn about the range of what the different opportunities are. Because this is something I've been pushing cities for a long time, which is they need to think about what they want. There have been a lot of discussions where people have talked about going into a city and a development company or an operator saying, here's what we need. And I've told a lot of city folks, it's kind of like, you need to tell them what you need. This should be a collaboration of what you need. And when they come in and say, tell us about your curb space, you need to say, well, we need to know how you're going to service the whole city, or how you're going to complement our public transit system rather than compete with it. I mean, I think there's a lot of these questions that are known. And so my response to that council member would be, one, get educated. A second thing is, I think every city ought to set up their own working group. Whether it's a task force or a committee, you need your city planners, you need some folks with some of the technology expertise, but you need a diverse group, right, that gets to come together and be able to talk about what the city needs and what they're looking for when they actually want to collaborate with someone who's interested in deploying in that city. So I think those are the two big ones: get educated, set up a working group. And then the third thing is, you should have a strategic plan. You literally should develop a strategic plan for AV deployment in your city, because cities are, they have a lot of commonalities and a lot of differences. And so I think, that a council member should sit there and think about, okay, I'm informed now, I got my group together, what's my plan? Do I want to start with, again, the urban and the city with things? Do I want to think about my complement to public transit? Do I want to think about the curb space issue? And part of the reason I mention this is because for a while I was telling states, don't everybody do the same thing.
Yeah.
There's so much to learn here. How great it would be if cities were doing some core things like the three things I just mentioned, and then do some different stuff and then share.
Right.
So when you learn, oh, we did these three things and they didn't work, share that with people. And we did these three things and they worked really well, share those as right. Because everybody's still trying to figure this stuff out. And as I just said, I think the deployment in the cities is like the big challenge now. Yep. And I think that's why I say that's a great question from where the rubber meets the road. Is like, so how do we prepare?
And that was why PAVE started our Public Sector Advisory Council last year, was to try to get some of those perspectives from cities who've been there and who've been through this to share with other places. One of the things we talk about a lot at PAVE is obviously the potential benefits of AVs. And one of those is improving transportation for people who are left out of the current system, who aren't well served by the current transportation system, including issues of equity and affordability. We got several questions about that, about how we can broaden that. And one question from our dear friends at Johns Hopkins was, what role do you anticipate Zoox serving, or that other companies could serve in the efforts to improve mobility equity in urban regions, and similar questions about affordability?
So let's pull that apart in just a couple ways. One is the mobility that I think people throw that out, but they don't really think about it. But let me just talk about three groups that have a chance for AVs to totally change their lives. So we're all getting older in the United States. And between the number of people that are 65 and older that have their keys, and the disabled community, which may not have a license or ever be able to get a license, or have certain constraints around their transportation, there are 100 million people in the United States in those two categories. And a third category that doesn't get talked about much are kids. Yeah. I know folks in San Francisco where their kids are actually in two different school districts. And if you have one car in the city, you're trying to figure out, how do I get kid one, to do this, kid two to do this, and they're both at the same time after school or whatever, or I got to get there. And so, those three groups represent 100 million plus all the kids, that could open up worlds. And we're talking about work, school, healthcare, social, right? It's just like, when we think mobility, we got to be able to not just to quantify, but realize what this means to their lives when there is literally a method for them to get from point A to point B. Now, the second, so I think that's one of those opportunities we need to be even more explicit about. And I think it's absolutely appropriate, again, when a city is talking to, somebody wants to deploy AVs in their city, is to ask that question. Here are these groups. How are you going to, and by the way, it doesn't all get done at point, time point one, right? I mean, this stuff takes a while to develop and, et cetera. And I think the other part, though, that's highlighted by the question is just the equitable access, right? And that's beyond just, say, the disability community and some of the, issues that they confront. I was fortunate enough to work with Secretary Anthony Fox, who was a mayor in Charlotte, and he wrote a lot about transportation actually has divided our country in many areas, in many different arenas, how the highway system was built, et cetera. And so we have an opportunity now to kind of figure out how we want to make sure the new mobility that's coming is actually equitable. And I think one of the obvious ways to think about this is if you have a robot that basically is just programmed to go where it's needed, that should open up all areas of the city, right? You don't have a human trying to decide, am I taking that trip or not, right? For whatever reason. But it's just like, a robot will go where it needs to go. We hope even more efficiently, because it's not going to be driving around looking for fares. It's going to have an algorithm, so it's going to be more efficient. But I think, that's another thing, as we were saying, that council member needs to ask, right? How are you going to help us address some of these issues? Because we know there are communities of color where public transit is just vital to what they do. And how do we ensure that this new mobility actually helps support them being the heroes that they are in this pandemic, right? I mean, it's just, there's a new tool and a new asset. How do we make sure we get the full benefit when we actually deploy this asset?
Well, and I think that you probably, most of that kind of answers this question, but another question we got was that, obviously deployments require a relationship between the company and the city, and what aspects did you consider, and how did you, what was your approach with local governments to determine where you deployed your vehicle?
Yeah, I got to tell you, I think that's critical. Again, rubber meets the road in the cities, and that's where all the action is right now. And so you have to both, respect, be transparent, and have a lot of interactions with local governments. And I would say that's one of the things Zooks has really put as a priority for us, is to make sure we're interacting with them. And I'll tell you that people often think, well, that means the mayor or the council, et cetera. And I think that's absolutely true. But we've also set a priority to interact with first responders, for example. And I make the comment sometimes that the political landscape changes, but the law enforcement, the firefighters, the EMTs, they are a core of the city, and they deal with, the road safety issues. And so we've really gone out of I come from a law enforcement family. It's been a priority for us. But I really think making sure that you deal not only with the structure of the governing bodies that are there, but with the folks who are really, the vibrant elements that make the city real, like law enforcement, the cops and the firefighters and the EMTs. You want to communicate and interact with them so that they're all part of the conversation. And I think that stuff is just absolutely critical if you want these cities not just to be educated about stuff. So we've had over 35 interactions, with a bunch of first responders, learning about what do you need? What do you expect? What are you concerned about? What information do we need to give you? So we're creating what we hope will become kind of a state-of-the-art education training program just for first responders, because it's more than worrying about, which wire can I cut or shouldn't I cut? It's way more than that. And unless you interact and know what their concerns are or how they want to help, you're not going to know. And so I just got to tell you, they've been so welcoming, frankly, because they know this is coming and they want to get the benefits like everybody else.
Exactly. We actually did one of these panels last fall, or a couple that we had folks, a police officer from Mountain View, and then someone from Chandler, in first responders, talking about some of the really fundamental questions that they have other people come in. How do you open the door? How do you pull one of these cars over? And it really is a whole, interesting realm of things to think about.
And by the way, I know Captain Jaeger, Saul, who's the guy from Mountain View, and
Exactly.
he lives here in Silicon Valley, so he's been exposed to this a lot. He's a great example of someone who's been very forthcoming, and not only wants to talk to developers and manufacturers, but to the first responder community.
Yep.
Because as much as we talk to them, it means a lot more sometimes coming from another cop or firefighter or EMT. And we need people like Saul and the other folk that Chandler, those folks to actually be engaged, because they're the ones who are going to have the highest impact within their own communities, to not just be accepted, to make sure these are safe and effective when they're deployed.
And you're exactly right. And one of the things he talked about was that relationship and how it has to be open communication. And he was very, said wonderful things about the companies there in terms of sharing information, helping prepare the first responders with the information they need. And then likewise asking the companies, having the companies share, so but both sides are getting what their questions answered. So he's wonderful. Well, another question we got from the audience is, and this is another really broad one, but what was the one thing you would recommend be done to increase adoption of AVs, widespread adoption? I know there are a lot of answers to that, but
Which is why I have three.
perfect.
And I think, well, because people have asked this before, and three specific things that I believe are that's going to facilitate acceptance: data, transparency, and experience. So I think we talked about this earlier. You know, every company, everyone involved is going to have real data to show you've met your safety case, it's effective doing X, Y, Z. You need data. The second part is you got to be transparent about the data. You know, now you don't have to necessarily show everything all at once because a lot of this stuff is in development. But if, you know, at some point you've got targets and you've reached it, you'll be able to transparently be able to show how you got there. You know, and this is why we feel comfortable doing this, right? So I think you need the data, you need the transparency, but the third one is experience. And I love to bring this one up. I'll try and do it quickly. It's like before the iPhone was developed, if somebody had done a survey and just said, you know, would you buy a phone for your pocket, you know, and pay this much? And oh, well, maybe you'll buy two. Would you buy two of them? You know, and by the way, you may not talk on the phone. You may actually be texting. What's a text? Oh, well, that's an app. What's an app? If you would ask people before the iPhone exists, you know, would you buy one? Would you use one? How much? You know, I don't think you could have ever predicted the world we're in now, right? Where it's glued to our hand, people are so distracted, etc. So I think we're in the same position now with AVs. And that is kind of, again, what Aicha was explaining. You want it to be boring, right?
Yep.
But that, and you want it to be comfortable and you're not giving it a second thought, but that comes from experience with the actual technology. So that's a disadvantage we have right now. We should be creating the data. We should be transparent about it. But I think, and PAVE has held some, you know, actual demo days, et cetera, where people get to actually experience some of the, but I think that's going to be more and more critical because the increase in actual experience is, you know, like, oh yeah, I've been in that, big deal. It's on, you know, it's on my phone now. I'm already using it. I had a great ride here and this was good there. And oh, I learned a new thing on the, that's where you want people, but you only get that from experience. And so again, I think, you know, the surveys aren't very informative because the technology isn't actually in service right now, right? And so again, I think we need data. We need the transparency to why it's safe, why it's effective, what you're doing to address the issues that we've been talking about. But the other thing is we need experience. And that's why I think all of the pilots, the demonstrations, the actual services that are starting are critical because they will give people actual experience in these vehicles. And then I hope they're going to be just like what Aicha said, right? Oh, that was cool. And then in about a minute or two, yeah, I was on the phone, I was reading a book, I was talking to my family, right? It was boring. What's the deal?
That's exactly before the pandemic last year. I had the great pleasure of going out to California for a deployment. Our friends at Voyage were beginning a deployment in a community of older Americans. And we had a meeting with a lot of the residents. And you're exactly right, that when it became real and tangible, all of their questions were these really, you know, how does this impact my life? How can this make my life better? You know, things along the lines of, if I want to go to this sports facility, but it doesn't actually have an address that I can type in, like, how do I tell the vehicle to stop? And once it becomes real and it's no longer this Jetsons-esque, you know, sci-fi thing, that people really start seeing it as a real part of their lives.
Yeah. And by the way, you just brought up two things. One is that's the whole thing about the experience. Videos are great. Talking about it's helpful. But until you're actually like trying to, you know, call it, get in it, etc., totally different. And the other thing is you just talked about, there's one of those real world challenges. Well, I want to go to the sports center, but I don't know where the address is, right? Or I'm in a closed community that doesn't really have an address for that. You know, how do I, those are the real world challenges that, you know, we're now confronting.
Trying to figure out, yeah, exactly. Along those lines, this is one of these nearly impossible questions that you predicted, but an audience member asked, when do you see AVs becoming a reality, even in small numbers?
So, you know, what's interesting about this one is I've actually been giving the same answer since when being administrator at NHTSA. And I think it's become clearer now. in the next 3 years, we're going to start seeing small numbers of actual deployments.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think to what we were just talking about, there are going to be more and more opportunities in the coming 3 years for people to actually get experience in these kinds of AV new technology, and where they really get to be the rider who's bored from that ride, letting them just enjoy wherever they're going from point A to point B. So I think in the next 3 years, and we're already seeing the beginnings of that now. But I also think this is a continuum. It's a timeline where in the next 3 years, I mean, the technology is already out there. We're starting to see it. And I think in the next 3 years, we're going to be more concrete seeing these pop up. You've already been in the Voyage one. Waymo's doing some stuff. Zoox is something that's in the works. I mean, it's just, we're going to start seeing these in the next 3 years. But and Aicha mentioned, right, Las Vegas, San Francisco, people are working on the actual challenges of the deployment. Okay. But I think the other part of the continuum is people have to realize that, before in the future, when you can actually fly into another city, get out of the, airport and get your app for Zoox, that's going to be, any place in the world, that's 20 or 30 years away.
Right.
And I don't think people realize this, but when there's new technology, it usually takes around 15 years for even one new technology to make it into the 265 million cars that are on the road. 15 years for a new technology, even if there's a regulation that says get it in there. And so this, which is so transformative for our society, to really see it everywhere, that's going to be, again, a 20 to 30 year. And again, I think it could be, we could see an acceleration of that in some places, but people got to realize within 3 years, you may get your chance to actually have that firsthand experience. And then probably in 20 or 30 is where all those societal benefits we're looking for will start being realized.
Right. Yes, in the long haul. So we're close to running out of time. The last question, I just want to ask you if you have any predictions, expectations for 2021. What do you see from the AV world this year?
I expect it to be super exciting in the sense that, a pandemic has engulfed our world, and we see even more how much AVs could benefit society. And at the end of 20, for all of the horrific things going on, we saw a lot of action in the last quarter of 20 in the AV space. And I won't talk about the whole industry, but even just Zoox doing our reveal,
Absolutely.
And a bunch of other, it's just like, and a lot of others did the same thing, with different pieces of it. And so I think, what was supposed to be slow and everybody focused on pandemic, guess what? There's a lot of action. And so I think 21, as we emerge into the light, that basically there's going to be a lot of action going on. And I think, again, rubber meets the road. We'll see the technology advances, but even more importantly, I think we're going to see more of a focus on the deployment and how we're going to actually get to scale so that we get the societal benefits that we know are going to be available to us.
And that was one of the interesting things of the pandemic, was to see some use cases that to be able to see AVs used in cases where contactless transportation was valuable. And so if there was any slight, tiny silver lining of 2020, that might have been one of them. Well, thank you, Mark, so much for your time today. Always wonderful to see you and talk to you. And it's been so exciting to watch Zoox the last several weeks and the last year. And we're really excited to see what is yet to come. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. We're excited to begin our panel series again for 2021 and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Go PAVE.